I have never gotten as many messages from listeners as I have over the past week. In the message section at the newsletter and the form that anyone can fill out at my website, so many notes have been coming in. People are understandably fed up with the media. Some people are terrified about the changes Trump is making to the government. They say this is an existential crisis for democracy and that the media is normalizing it. Others are saying, look at the hostages from Israel who have been released. It's horrifying. Even medical professionals say they look like concentration camp survivors. And this is after more than a year of the mainstream media insisting that it's Israel starving people. A claim called into question by a new scientific study that's coming up. When mainstream news organizations hear these kinds of complaints, they go straight to a political lens. They subscribe to the big lie of the left, which I have talked about in previous episodes, this whole idea of Israel as this imaginary big bad evil thing. So they ignore the complaints about that stuff. Meanwhile, they say, oh no, when it comes to the Trump stuff, we really are covering this. But right-wing politicians and right-wing media have told people not to pay attention to us. So there are people who aren't listening. These major news agencies are very quick to blame anyone but themselves for the fact that people have tuned out. It's also the case that right-wing news organizations do downplay the threats from the right as a rule, but they also very often fill in the gaps where the major mainstream news organizations are failing, like in covering the threat of Islamist groups. They're unafraid to call that out. Looking into all this led me to a paradigm shift. There's a whole different way to look at the media's failures at this moment. It requires removing the political lens altogether. When I picture this, it's almost surgical. It's like we have to get that off of our eyes so we can see straight. We as Americans keep being presented with a false choice that we somehow have to subscribe to one of these two options. But what you all keep showing me through your fantastic feedback is that what so many of us want and need from the news media is the same thing. It has nothing to do with where we identify politically. It's up to the media to finally see that. I'll explain. Plus, did one of the most powerful health insurance companies use massively faulty AI to refuse coverage for life-saving healthcare? All that and more coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. So good to have you here. I'm Josh Lebs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact-checks the news and breaks down the systemic problems that prevent the news business from doing its job for you, getting you the truth. We've had so many new people join us over the last couple of weeks, so thank you for being here. It's so good to have you. I encourage you to go back and listen to earlier episodes as well. I often refer back to them, and the things I've talked about in earlier episodes continue to be relevant today. I also discovered one great way to share the word about this show. If you are on Substack, if you have a Substack account, you can recommend They Stand Corrected Substack to people. So if they subscribe to you, then they get this little box that pops up in which you're recommending this one as well. Everyone who is spreading the word and encouraging others to check out this show, so much appreciated. And be sure to subscribe, rate, review, all those good things. Okay, let's get into this. The overwhelming majority of Americans distrust the media, and it has been getting worse. So I went to look for what the media says about that, and here's what I found. These conversations are always put through a partisan lens. They say Democrats believe this, Republicans believe this. Never mind that a plurality of Americans are independent, which means more people identify as independent than with either party. Somehow that's not even mentioned. Here is an example of the kind of thing that keeps happening. I've got a couple clips for you here from a discussion on CNN. First, Lulu Garcia-Navarro of the New York Times.
There's been a concerted attempt from the highest echelons of one party to discredit the media over and over again. There has been just sort of an atmosphere here where we now put journalists in the role of prize fighters.
And conservative pollster Kristen Soltis Anderson.
For Democrats, they are expecting journalists to be those prize fighters for their cause and get mad at mainstream outlets when they don't say, oh, and by the way, Donald Trump is terrible and a fascist. And like they get mad when those things are not appended to the end of every piece. And I think that is also part of what's driving.
Those points are fair. Trump has called the mainstream media the enemy of the state, which it is not. By fighting for a better media that does its job, I'm fighting for the media, for a strong fourth estate that gives you the truth. The media is not the enemy. We need it to do the job all around. But since these conversations are always through a partisan lens, the media itself keeps missing the point of what Americans actually need. Straight up, truth, which equals facts plus context. In these conversations and also written pieces, it doesn't seem to occur to anyone to set aside the politics for a moment and focus on how revolutionary it would be if any news agency decided from now on, we're only going to use our platforms to present information that we have fact-checked. It doesn't even occur to anyone to do this. So of course, people are tuning out. They don't know if what they're getting is going to be true. I'm going to share a couple segments with you now from MSNBC. And I mentioned earlier, I've been getting all these messages. I got a question from a listener saying he had heard a couple of episodes and how come I'm not spending all my episodes going after Fox News? Well, I have explained this in the past, so always listen to more than 2 episodes. But there are new people. So as we go into this MSNBC clip, I'll give you a brief summary of what I've explained. At this point, it's ridiculous for anyone to think that Fox is even trying to be some sort of general news site for fair-minded coverage of domestic issues and U.S. politics. Fox is openly, proudly designed to push right-wing agendas and Trumpism now. And Fox admitted that it pushed the big lie of the right about a stolen election. I've also explained that the mainstream media calls out Fox and other right-wing stuff, and I've played clips of that before. But the mainstream media does not call out the big lie of the left, which is just as anti-democratic. It's this pro-Islamist effort to dismantle the only democracy in the Middle East and to go after the United States and the West in general. The mainstream media sucks on that, and that needs to be called out. What we need is the mainstream media to start doing its job. Anyway, this is why I do include MSNBC here, because the mainstream media does not call out MSNBC. So, MSNBC had on Michelle Norris. She's a contributing editor there. Actually, she and I overlapped back at NPR. She was talking with host Alex Wagner about problems with the media. And of course, as always, they were talking through a political lens. So Michelle Norris said this.
He entered into politics on a hot gust of grievance, and much of that was directed at the media. The phrase fake news has entered our lexicon because of him. And we should be clear, it's not that he sees everyone in the media as his enemy. He has appointed several people from Fox News to be part of his cabinet in his incoming administration. What he does not like is scrutiny. What he does not like is a press corps that is willing to ask tough questions, that will put his policies and his leadership under a microscope.
Obviously talking about Trump. Then, in this same interview, she and Alex Wagner started talking about AI, and Michelle Norris said this.
There's another story in the news right now with the man that was assassinated in New York City. United Healthcare, his company was under investigation because they were using an AI system to measure medical claims, and that system had a 90% failure rate.
Then the two of them just kept going with their conversation. But wait a second, is that true? That's a big thing to say and then just move on from. What she said there was that she heard this figure in the news, and then they kept going. So you're talking about problems with the media, and then you throw out a figure that could have life and death stakes for individual Americans. And la-di-da, let's just keep talking. No one dare fact-check this. And I went to look and see if maybe they fact-checked it afterwards, which would have been incredibly unusual. And of course they didn't. This is normal in news, to have these conversations and then completely forget the basics of journalism, which is to make sure that you're giving people truth. Anyone can say anything on social media. You don't need news organizations for that. This open mic night system is not news. Americans, no matter where they stand politically, need news agencies to provide us with only truth. but it doesn't occur to news agencies to do that. So of course people are giving up. And of course that's going to lead them into more ideologically driven options. There's nowhere for them to turn to trust that they will just keep getting facts. Well, they didn't fact check this, so I will for you briefly here. That figure was an allegation in a lawsuit against United Healthcare. I have looked at the lawsuit. It's not clear where the people suing got that 90% figure from. A spokesperson for the group that made that AI tool, there's this written story I did find on CBS Money Watch, in which the spokesperson said that the AI-powered tool is not used to make coverage determinations, but has helped as a guide. So we don't know whether that claim is true. There is a piece from Snopes about this, which I'll put in the newsletter. Look, the entire system of health insurance and coverage is a mess. There absolutely is corruption, and there are so many unfair decisions that are made all the time that do impact life and death. That doesn't mean that this specific claim is true or false. There is this growing illiberal mindset these days in which if you don't like a group or entity or industry, then everything they say or do is wrong, and everyone who complains about them is right. The news should always go back and check what's true. Here's another example. This one's especially significant for what it says about the whole ethos of They Stand Corrected. This is from PBS. They had on Jody Ginsburg, head of an organization called the Committee to Protect Journalists. They began the conversation focusing on Trump and politics, which, to be fair, is part of the story, but only part of it. They did not talk about the failure of news agencies to fact check and that kind of thing. Then Jody Ginsburg brought up this, which is true.
News media can rebuild trust by continuing to do what journalism does, which is to publish news and information in the public interest. And while it's true that there has been this drop-off in trust at national level, people remain highly trusting of their local media, which often has the most impact. Those are the areas that have been totally hollowed out financially in recent years.
Yep, that is a big problem. And then, I kid you not, this is not me doing it, okay? This is what the media does all the time. Immediately after that, the interviewer, Jeff Bennett, went straight to this.
I want to ask you about the dramatic rise in violence and risk facing journalists around the globe. A CPJ report says at least 137 journalists and media workers have been killed in Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, and Lebanon since the war started.
Arg. That statistic is not legitimate. They did it again. This is what happens. If journalists took literally, no exaggeration, 2 minutes, probably 1 minute, to fact check that statistic, here's what they would find. That figure that her group, the CPJ, has been pushing is not trustworthy. It includes people who Hamas claims were quote-unquote journalists. It includes propagandists for the Islamist terrorist organization, the group that has no belief in freedom of speech or the press, straight-up members of this terrorist organization. There was a great analysis of this CPJ claim by an independent journalist, David Collier. He took the time to go through these names from Hamas, which were then repeated in the CPJ list of alleged killed journalists. And his big study, I'll post it in the newsletter, you can check it out. It says, quote, the Hamas list was quickly found to be full of errors containing many Hamas or Islamic Jihad members, along with others who are not connected to news gathering or reporting. He also pulled up some social media posts from these alleged slaughtered journalists. Here's one on October 7th. I swear my eyes cried with joy because of the bravery of our heroes. Yes, the heroes who went around slaughtering innocent civilians and carrying out mass rapes and other unimaginably evil things. Here's another one. Kill them. May Allah punish them with your hands and humiliate them. I don't want to pass over this. I mentioned just now independent journalist David Collier. Think about that for a second. No major news agency, with all their money, all their personnel, a lot of these places, not PBS probably, but a lot of these places have anchors who are being paid millions of dollars. All these people, and no one that I can find anywhere in mainstream media took the time to even look into that figure from CPJ. Anytime the media cites any figure, it should be standard to check it out first. But they don't. Here they are talking about how the media has problems. And they go straight from, we must be bastions of truth, to, here's a claim I heard but have never looked into, and I'm going to present it to you, the audience, anyway, as though it's a fact. This brings us to something that I want to tackle based on some of these amazing messages I've been getting. That's coming up. Just 4 sentences. That is the full length of a petition that I'm asking you to sign. It's so important right now. Through all my years in journalism, I've seen what kinds of petitions make a difference, and I believe this one will. It demands the release of all the remaining hostages, and it addresses the signs of starvation and abuse. It takes less than 1 minute to sign, and if you do, using my unique link, then you'll be helping support this show thanks to a paid sponsorship. But it's just for a very limited time. So while you're listening, check out the show notes and you'll see a link. It starts with bit.ly, bit.ly. You'll see it. It takes you straight to the petition. You sign, and that's it. Thank you. Some people are more concerned about right-wing efforts to subvert democracy in America and around the world. They think that the representations of Israel and treating Islamist terrorist groups as though they're legitimate sources of news, even if they're willing to acknowledge that that problem exists, they think it's farther away. They think it's less relevant. Well, I have 2 words for you: Super Bowl.
Here on Bourbon Street, always the heart and soul of New Orleans, this year began with a terror attack that tried to shatter its spirit.
Before the game, there was this from New Orleans with Michael Strahan and Tom Brady.
But the resilience of New Orleans is matched by the resolve of our country. When tragedy strikes, we don't break, we come together, we rise above, and never let evil win.
They then went into a performance from Lady Gaga.
Hold my hand, everything will be okay. I heard from the heavens, whose clouds have been gray. Pull me close, wrap me in.
What they were referring to there on Bourbon Street was an Islamist terrorist attack on New Year's Eve. A guy who had pledged allegiance to ISIS drove a truck through a packed crowd, killing at least 14 people and wounding at least 35 others at last count. I talked about this in episode 39. The media is not acknowledging the extent of this danger, and news agencies regularly allow people to downplay the popularity and support for terrorism among so many Muslim people in the world. Here's a clip from that episode. I started with a relatively typical comment that you see often in the media. This one was from Reza Aslan speaking on NBC back in 2015.
Every single organization, major organization, Muslim organization throughout the world and in the United States, every prominent individual, be it political or religious leaders, everyone has condemned not just this attack, but every attack that occurs in the name of Islam.
That has never been true. Obviously, tons of Muslim leaders and groups justify and praise terrorists. A lot of people in the media are so afraid of being called Islamophobic that they refuse to state certain facts. There's a survey that looked at support for anti-American terrorism. It found that across 12 Muslim nations, the majority supported attacks against the United States everywhere, 52%. Those figures are from back in 2017. Recently, we've seen massive global support for terrorism. In the United States, 21% of Muslims said last year that Hamas's October 7th massacres were acceptable. In the UK, nearly half of Muslims said they support Hamas after what it did. And of course, this does not mean that all Muslim people support these attacks. But the reality is that it is representative of the Islam that many people are learning. I also explained in that episode that Islamist terrorist attacks are on the rise all over the world. There's a group called Fondapol that found between 2013 and early 2024, more than 56,000 Islamist attacks took place worldwide, and says Islamist attacks represent more than 84% of terrorist attacks since 1979. I don't do a lot of numbers on this show, and I never expect anyone to memorize them. You can see them in the newsletter. Before Trump got the Electoral College win in 2016 to become president, there were a lot of people trying to help Americans understand that Hillary Clinton was not some sort of inevitable victor, that there was a rise of the political right around the world. They were like, look at Brexit, look at a large swath of Europe. This is happening. Both are threats to our democracy. Coming up, when people in mainstream media say, we do call out Trump and all these problems, and we need people to pay attention to us, not only can you say to them, well, people shouldn't be paying attention to you because of your ethical failure on all this other stuff, you can also say to them, seriously, do you know how long you have been giving Trump and his team an open mic night? Along with some messages that we've played for you from listeners, I've also gotten some from people who want to remain anonymous. They support the show, they contribute, and part of what I have offered is that I will read messages from them. What I wasn't prepared for was some of these really beautiful messages that I'm getting. And there are two reasons that I struggle to read this. One is the humble bragginess, and the other is, to me, it has an emotional effect. Okay, quote, I think the work you are doing is one of the most important causes that I've seen in quite some time, especially given the climate and lens that most people see the world through. You address specific issues using the most reputable sources possible and illustrate exactly why they're not reputable and why they fall short in an entirely objective way. It's clear to me the work you're doing is the kind of work the public needs. I love that I can't tell from your podcast if you are a Republican or a Democrat. I love that nobody's off limits and that you cite exactly where you see the fallacies. And I love that you are smart enough to read past rhetoric and find when what's being said is contradictory and just doesn't make sense. This is one of the biggest problems with us being passive listeners and subscribers to whatever headlines we see. We just don't have enough objective information to put things in context and separate rhetoric or narrative from fact. This is why I want to support your podcast. Thank you. If you want to support this show, you can become a paid subscriber at the newsletter. There's also a link at the website, joshlevs.com, where you can make a one-time or monthly donation. We're back. This is They Stand Corrected. I'm Josh Levs. The partisan discussions about the media's problems, those are what I've found in the media itself. But what you show me in your messages is so fantastic. You bring me things from across the spectrum. If you're new to this show, you might want to listen to a bunch of episodes I've done about politicians in general, on all sides, being allowed these open mic nights to just lie. This was a clip from episode 20.
Please welcome the frontrunner for the Republican nomination, former President Donald Trump.
That was CNN hosting a town hall for Trump right after a jury found him liable for battery and defamation in a civil trial involving E. Jean Carroll. They found that he sexually abused her. The Washington Post later had a headline, quote, "Judge clarifies, yes, Trump was found to have raped E. Jean Carroll." CNN's town hall was all about him lying. He steamrolled the host. I was quoted in a couple of news articles about this. I explained that it doesn't matter what someone's title is or was. You don't give liars a live platform. That's not journalism. When a lot of people criticized CNN over this, CNN responded with a ridiculous argument. This is so significant in understanding the thinking inside these news organizations. Here's Anderson Cooper spouting this nonsense.
You have every right to be outraged today and angry and never watch this network again. But do you think staying in your silo and only listening to people you agree with is going to make that person go away?
They think it's either ignore someone or give them a live platform, an open mic. It's neither of those. Record interviews, play them with fact checks, show the difference between what the person said and what the truth is. Actually, that episode is especially timely now because I also talked about Kanye. He had been on his previous anti-Semitic binge, and there was this anchor at News Nation who tweeted that people should just ignore it, that somehow it doesn't really matter. And I was like, what? No. When someone that prominent goes on a hate rant and calls for DEFCON, you talk about it. Anyway, that same anchor then reversed himself and put Kanye on live to spout lies again, as though somehow those are the only two choices. And of course, now Kanye is proudly calling himself a Nazi and Hitler fan and saying Jews should be slaves and blah, blah, blah. See my newsletter and my Instagram about that. I talk about something celebs should be doing. Anyway, many people who have contacted me about the media letting Trump get away with lies have also contacted me about something I mentioned at the top. and that is the physical condition of Israeli hostages who have been held by Hamas. It is horrifying. Many of you have pointed out to me that the media has been screaming all this time, Israel is starving Gazans, but not screaming what's happening to the people Hamas is holding on to. Maybe they're being starved. I mentioned at the top, there's a new scientific study. I'll post this in the newsletter. It's up at the National Institutes of Health website. It's from a team of researchers at a bunch of Israeli universities. Like in America, these are scientists in a democracy, so they're not controlled by a government the way that, for example, a quote-unquote health bureau is in Gaza. Anyway, they went through amounts of food delivered from January to July 2024, and they found that in all but February, quote, food crossing the borders into Gaza exceeded per capita minimal requirements for humanitarian aid, and that, quote, these estimates suggest that adequate amounts of nutritious food were being transported into the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, just a few days ago, even the UN humanitarian chief said the threat of famine in Gaza has been averted. I cannot fact check for you how much food people have gotten because Hamas has a death grip on Gaza. So even with figures about how much food gets into Gaza, we cannot know how much actually gets to individuals because Hamas controls it. Also, the media never mentions this, but it's crucial to keep this in mind. Hamas terrorists slaughtered people at that kibbutz on October 7th, 2023. I talked about this in my October 7th anniversary speech. These were peacenik farmers on the kibbutz who were trying to grow organic vegetables together with people in Gaza. And it turned out that people in Gaza had been asking these folks for pictures of their crops, but what they were actually doing was using the backgrounds of the photos to map out the kibbutz so they could show up and kill people. They specifically attack people who are trying to help them grow food, which not that they have to help. I mean, there's been billions of dollars put into Gaza. They could be spending it on food instead of tunnels, but they slaughter these people and then scream famine. The whole thing is insane. But of course, no one should have to face famine. Anyway, I searched to see whether any mainstream news agencies had devoted any resources to exploring whether Israeli hostages were being starved in Gaza, and there's no sign that any did. AP headlines about starving in the region were about people who live in Gaza, not hostages. Over at NPR, I searched keywords, and everything that popped up was about Gazans starving. I finally found one piece.
We were taken to a house with terrorists that was so mean and so cruel.
This was Aviva Siegel, a teacher taken hostage in the October 7th massacres.
They used to starve us and eat in front of us.
That line was not in the headline of the story online or played up anywhere as far as I can tell. So who knows how much attention this kind of thing even got. When you hear that, if you're in the news business, you should immediately start looking into whether other hostages are also being starved. Keep talking about it. Contact U.S. officials and find out what they're doing about Americans who are being held and may be starved. But there's no sign that this was even pursued. In looking into this topic for you, I also came across another journalistic disaster. There were all these reports about what an Israeli minister allegedly said at one point. Here was a clip from CNN.
Israel's finance minister suggests it's just and moral to let millions of people starve in Gaza. More on those shocking comments ahead.
Ugh, no. The minister they're referring to is very controversial and was condemned by tons of people, including in Israel. Here's what he actually said, quote, no one in the world would let us starve and thirst 2 million citizens, even though it may be just and moral until they return our hostages. He also said you cannot fight Hamas with one hand and give them aid with the other. If you look at that quote, it can be interpreted in all kinds of ways. So, for example, if you keep providing an area with food and water, even though they are starving and torturing your innocent citizens, and the public there overwhelmingly supports those actions, are you putting less value on your own kidnapped citizens whom you need to protect? It's unethical to starve and thirst anyone, even if the other side is doing it. But he did say maybe, like hypothetically. Anyway, it certainly did not justify half quotes and misquotes from CNN. Here's another one.
This is coming from Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. He's a man who just recently said that but for world opinion, Israel would be morally justified to starve 2 million people in Gaza to death. So clearly, this is a man who's, a fanatic within the Israeli government.
Journalism is a mission. People should only be in it to achieve the mission, which is to provide truth. That's facts plus context. Media. Maybe if you try doing that, then people will start trusting you and paying attention. Maybe if you start committing to truth always, then those low trust scores you have will turn around. In the meantime, I will keep doing this, and I need your support. You can support this show by rating and reviewing it on whichever platforms you use, or becoming a paid subscriber at the newsletter, or making a contribution through the website. Every act of support means a lot. And get in touch. Tell me your thoughts. Paid subscribers reach me directly through the newsletter, and everyone else can fill in this really cool form through my website that is designed to avoid spammers and bots and haters. So keep those great messages coming. I look forward to hearing from you, and I will see you next week.